Let us not become conceited, provoking one another, envying one another. Brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgressions, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. Bear one another's burdens and also fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself.
Right. So if you didn't get your Bible open to Galatians chapter 5 and 6, do that. Or if you need to look it up on a phone or a device, I would love for you to follow along with us in that passage. It will take me a minute to get there, but I would love for you to kind of follow along with us in that passage that I'll teach through this afternoon. So it's great to see all of you here today. It's a blessing to feel like this room is packed out with people and just to see what God's doing to bring this group of people together. So this is week 2 of a series we call Gospel People. And I explained a little bit about like why and what that means. It can be a little confusing at first glance. What do you mean gospel people? What I mean by that is there's all kinds of people that kind of categorize themselves and sort of put themselves in little boxes. And we know the people like by the categories and the likes that they have. So last week I talked about coffee people. You know, the coffee people who like their day is made or broken by like if they got their coffee and how good the coffee was. And I talked about certain people who like have gone so far as to like get tattoos of like coffee on their bodies. And little did I know that someone would take me, like they got inspired last week. I'm not gonna name any names. And they went out and got a coffee bean tattoo last week after I said that. So I'm not gonna name any names, but I was like, this is great. I know the power now of preaching that I can get someone to get a tattoo after a sermon. So if any of you get a tattoo this week, let me know from something I said. That would be fantastic. It's happened once, it can happen again. So we talked about coffee people, we talked about fitness people, we talked about UGA football people. You know, like the people, like, so there's groups of people, like you know them by like that affinity that they have. Like you just know that's a coffee person, that's a UGA football person, that's a fitness person, that's a foodie person, etc. And so that's the idea behind this series. That what would it look like if we were gospel people? What would it look like as a church if we were known as people who loved and embraced and lived out and just it bubbled out of us the gospel? So that's the idea. This is week 2. Last week, I just simply tried to explain what is the gospel. We got to go back to it. Like Ben said, it is simple. It's simple. Jesus came and took our place. That's the beauty of it, that Jesus loves us. And I brought this up last week. I'll bring it up again. Here's the problem. The problem for us is we can sometimes get a hold of that message, like we know it in our heads, but it hasn't always gotten down into our nervous system, if you will. Sometimes, like we go through an entire day and the gospel hasn't impacted us at all. Some in here, the gospel hasn't ever taken root in your heart, I'm sure. And I'm praying for that. I'm believing God will allow it to take root in your heart and you will turn to him for salvation. The gospel is simple. It's that we are sinners. We start with just that fact that we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We need someone to do what we cannot do, and that is to get to God. We can't get to God. No matter what we do, no matter how hard we try, we can't get to God. And the beauty is that God came to us. One of my favorite stories, maybe you hear me say this every week when I talk about a Bible story, but it really is one of my favorite stories in all the Bible, is one that Jesus tells in Luke 15. I'm going to bring up another story in Luke later, but in Luke 15, Jesus talks about 2 sons. One is what we know as the prodigal son. The prodigal son says, "Hey, Dad, give me my inheritance." And Dad, for whatever reason, decides to acquiesce to his request, and he gives his son all of his inheritance that he deserves. And that son goes off before he's dead, right? Who gives an inheritance before they're dead? So he gives his son his inheritance, and the son goes off and lives wild living, just wastes it away. All the work and things that the dad had done to bring that inheritance to be is gone like that. Now you can imagine if you're the son, you're thinking in your mind, like, I can't imagine what my dad would think of me now. But he starts to work up his courage because the son has found himself in a really tough situation. He's like in the bottom of the bottom, and he's like ready to eat the food that's laying on the ground with the animals he's keeping. And there's a lot more to that context, but he says, you know what? I'm going to go back to my dad. And he goes back, and he's thinking in his mind, I'm just going to go back to my dad. I'm going to say, I don't deserve anything at all, but will you just like at least let me work for you? And the crazy part of that story is, as he's going to his dad, as he's on his way back, his dad sees him. And you would think there'd be all the shame and just like his dad would be like, don't even come near me again. But his dad runs to him and throws his arms around him. And he takes off his robe and he puts his robe on him. He gives him his ring. And he basically says, not only like, do I welcome you back, but you have all the inheritance that you just wasted. You have it again. You're back in the family. It's this unbelievable story that we think that illustrates the gospel that we just don't quite, in my opinion, hear all the way and completely experience all the way. Think about that. Did you wake up this morning experiencing that kind of gospel, knowing that God loves you so much that he would run after you? That's the story of the gospel, that Jesus came to us. That sets apart every other story in all the religions, is this story of God coming to us. So that's the gospel. I talked about last week. I said, you gotta know the gospel, that you're sinned and that you've sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, but Jesus came for you. He lived the life you could not live, and he died the death that you deserved, also that you could come into the family. That's the gospel message. We got to know that message. We have to be captured by that message. So that was my 2 points last week. This week, I have 1 point and like two steps within that. We have to preach the gospel. So I said you got to know it, you got to be captured by it, and this week you have to be able to preach the gospel. And here's 2 parts to that. We have to preach the gospel to ourselves. We have to preach the gospel to others. Preach the gospel to ourselves and preach the gospel to others. So that's the whole overview for what I want to talk about today. All right. So again, the gospel is not just good news that saves us. It's good news that fuels us day in and day out. The gospel is not just good news that saves us. It's good news that fuels us day in and day out. If the gospel worked in salvation for us, then it must work today. What good is it otherwise? Now, when I talk about preaching the gospel to ourselves and preaching the gospel to others, one of the first things that comes to mind is how we don't do this. Maybe it's just me, and I don't want to put everybody on the spot, but I just think I don't do this well, and maybe you guys would agree. If you're Christians, you're believers here today, maybe you would agree and say, yeah, I don't know if I'm like speaking the gospel over and over and over and over. So let me give you an example. Let's say there's someone who you really love in your life, and they're going through something. Like they come and they say, gosh, I'm having the worst experience right now at work. My boss, I cannot get this figured out. The relationship seems like I can't mend it, and there's drama. Substitute, if you don't work, substitute like a roommate or a friend. I can't get along with them. I can't figure this out, whatever and however that may have happened for you. Our first instinct is to go try to figure it out. Okay, so why don't you try this? When you see them next time, we start suggesting what? When you see them the next time, try to explain your point of view. I don't know what it is. We come up with our own ideas of how the situation can be solved. Maybe if you write an email to your boss and you explain this and this and this and this, and they'll get to see your point of view, and we try to solve the problem. And what I'm trying to say to you is, I don't think that's where we need to go. I think if we're gospel people, we always go to Jesus first. What does Jesus want to do right now as your boss is you're having this problem with your roommate, with your boss, with your friend, and you can't figure this out? Instead of me trying to figure it out for you, I'm saying, let's insert Jesus into this right now. Because I think if he had an answer for me in salvation, he has an answer for me right here today. And that answer is going to mimic the gospel in some way. In some way, it's going to show us. So what I'm saying is sounds a little bit like a Jesus juke, okay? You guys know that term? You heard that term? You know, when like somebody's talking and like all of a sudden you throw out something really spiritual and they call it, you just Jesus juke me. You guys, anybody heard that, okay? Everybody's looking at me like, maybe, I hope you have, okay? Jesus juke. I don't want you to give Jesus jukes, okay? But like here's an example, okay? So like here's a friend who's, if you don't know what I'm talking about, who's like, I can't wait for a beach vacation next week. I really need a break. And then the Jesus juke person says, imagine how much more relaxed you'd feel if you spent that time on a mission trip instead. Like, that's a Jesus juke, okay? If somebody says like, hey, oh, you got to see this hilarious cat video I found. And then the next friend, the Jesus juke friend, says, if only we were as excited about sharing the gospel as sharing cat videos. So that's what I'm talking about. Okay, so we're not going to be like that, but it will feel like that a little bit. Okay, we don't want to give out Jesus jukes. We want to give out gospel gifts. All right, I'm going to regret that later. Okay, Galatians 5, 24 through 6:3. I'm going to try to work through this because Paul, when he writes the book of Galatians, this is why I was really drawn to this text, is when he writes the book of Galatians, he's writing how the gospel plays out in our everyday life. He's showing us this gospel is for you day in and day out. It was for you at salvation. It's for you in your everyday life. And in verse 24, so we're going to work through this just verse by verse. He says, and those who belong to Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If you know Christ, just like Jesus went and died for us, in our everyday life, we now are crucified in the same way he was when it comes to our passions and our desires, our fleshly passions and desires. That means the things that we would want in our flesh that that counteract with what Jesus wants, we die to those things. And the gospel starts to play out in our life. Verse 25, it says, if we live by the Spirit, let us also keep in step with the Spirit. There's the positive way in which he says this, okay? Follow the Spirit, and if you do, you'll crucify the flesh. Let's keep in step with the Spirit. And then in verse 26, he says, let us not become conceited. This is interesting when he says this because he says it in two ways that we can become conceited. He says we can provoke one another or we can envy one another. We can provoke one another, we can envy one another, and we can be conceited in doing that. Okay, so let me break that down a little bit. Maybe you're catching on to this. That seems strange that you could be conceited by provoking someone or by envying someone. So let us not become conceited. The word that's used for conceited means vainglory. That means we're finding glory in something that is vain, something that doesn't matter. So he says, let us not become conceited. Let us not find vainglory by provoking one another. That first part makes sense. Like when we think we're better than someone, when we're conceited, we're finding vainglory in ourselves, we kind of provoke people sometimes. Yeah, you didn't get that, did you? Because I found that out a lot sooner than you did. You know, we're like kind of provoke. We poke at someone like, yeah, we're better. But then he says, this is why it's so surprising. He says, and because this is some of the camp I fall in more often. I don't know, maybe I provoke people. I could see that happening when I don't live in step with the gospel. But envying one another, like he says, you can find vainglory by envying someone. That seems strange. Like it doesn't seem like you're conceited by thinking someone like has stuff that you want and has a life that you want. But this is how the gospel works. It says you can find vainglory by thinking you're better, or you can find vainglory by thinking you're worse. Okay? So this is where the gospel kind of transforms us, because we think like, oh, we're being humble, we're being like, gospel people by thinking that we're not as good as someone. No. The gospel gives us complete humility and complete boldness at the same time. So if you know the gospel, you know how much Jesus loves you. And there are times where we just can't grab onto that. We want to kind of like wallow in our stuff and all the places that we kind of mess up, and we're like, don't feel great about ourselves. And we look at someone else and we're like, they got it really figured out, don't they? Like do you see them? They never miss a Bible study, and they're always at church, and they're serving. Like they got their act together. And look at me over here. I've sinned again. And Paul says, you're conceited when you're saying those things. We haven't grasped the gospel when we're living like that. You have to know completely and fully that the God of the universe sent his son for you and loves you. And he forgives you. Now, this is super important as we move into these next verses, because this is how we relate to one another. We have to speak the gospel to ourselves, and we have to speak the gospel to others. Because he says, brothers, if any of you are caught in a transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. In that verse, this can happen. And this is why I wanted to preach this sermon, is we have to preach the gospel to each other. As God puts his church together here at 5 Points Church, and people start to come and be a part of this church, we'll have to learn how to speak the gospel to one another. That has to be how we relate to each other. And there'll be times where someone can get caught in a sin. So keyword is caught. If someone sins here or there, there's forgiveness and grace in Jesus. That was costly to Jesus. He had to die for those sins. So that's not of any like small importance, but there's grace and forgiveness when we know the truth of Jesus. But Paul says if anyone's caught in a sin, so someone who's like returning to that sin, he says, you who are spiritual should restore. All right, so I know what you're thinking. You're like, okay, who's the spiritual people in here? Let's look around. Who are the spiritual people? Like, oh, the elders, they should do that. No, when Paul says you who are spiritual, he's speaking to all those who have God's Spirit. If you have God's Spirit, you're spiritual. You live in the spiritual realm. You know the God who is Spirit, and therefore you are spiritual. And so you who know God, you should restore them in a spirit of gentleness. Now, we would feel much better like just calling people out. Some of us, especially those who have a strong sense of justice, and we feel the pain of sin. If Robbie was lying all the time, and we were like, what is he doing? He said this and that. That's all this. We gotta do something about this. And some of us with that strong sense of justice would be like, let's just call him up to the front right now, and let's put him in front of everybody, and let's call him out. No, what Paul says is when that happens, you restore them in a spirit of gentleness. And this is really important. He says, keep watching on yourself, lest you too be tempted. If you think, so like the moment you know you're spiritual, you can start to think that you're too spiritual. If you think you're above this, you are not above this. You have to know that you, as Pastor Tim Keller put it, you're more sinful and flawed than you ever dared believe, but at the same time, you're more loved and accepted in Jesus Christ. That at any moment, except for the grace of God, you could fall into anything that anyone else has fallen into when it comes to sin. And then verse 2, it says, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. I'll take you to another story there in Luke 10. I mentioned that earlier. I would come back to this. It's a famous story. Even I know a lot of people who don't even know the Bible all that well have heard this story of what is known as the Good Samaritan. there were some teachers of the law that wanted to test Jesus, and they were asking for him to define, well, who's our neighbor? And Jesus tells them a story. And he says, there's a man who was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. And everyone immediately that would have been around Jesus as he heard that story right then and there would have known, oh, they're going through that part of town. It was known for how dangerous that section of road could be. It was not infrequent that people would be robbed on that road. And so when Jesus mentioned that, he then went on to say that there was a man to whom that happened. He was on his way from Jerusalem to Jericho, no doubt a Jew who was going to Jericho for business or something like that, and he is robbed. He's left on the side of the road half dead. And then Jesus says that there's a priest who comes along, a priest who's supposed to be worshiping God and leading people to worship God, and he sees the man, and he crosses over on the other side and does nothing. Then Jesus says there was a Levite, also a person who should be leading people to God and truly know God. And he sees the man laying on the side of the road, and he crosses on the other side. You've probably heard this story. But then comes along a Samaritan. And you probably also know that Jews and Samaritans don't have dealings together, would not have gotten along at all. And that Samaritan man sees this Jewish man on the side of the road, and to great expense to himself, you can imagine he's bleeding. I'm just imagining it's summer in Georgia and it's hot, and he's having to get all dirty and nasty and bandage him up, and he takes him to a nearby place. He pays for this man to be cared for. So all to great expense to himself does this Samaritan man take care of this guy to whom he does not know. It's a beautiful story of someone loving someone like that. And Jesus said, that's your neighbor. Now, you've probably heard that story over and over again, but it wasn't until I really heard that story that it made a big difference to me. Because if you grew up in church or you heard that story, more than likely it was given in such a way where they said, look, go be the Good Samaritan. Go take care of someone, even if someone you don't know, even someone you might not like, who's on the side of the road. And it may cost you a lot to go and do it, but go take care of that person. And Jesus tells this story, and if we understand the gospel, we would understand that, it's important to be like the Good Samaritan, but it's important to know who we are in that story. We're not we could be the priest or Levite, but I don't think that's who we are in that story. And we're certainly not the Good Samaritan in that story. In that story, we're the person who's beat up and on the side of the road, dead, half dead. And who's the Good Samaritan? Jesus. Jesus sees us in our need, and he comes to us, even though we've been an enemy to him, even though we've shaken our fist at God, we've wanted to go our own way. We would never in our flesh want to go after Jesus. The Bible says we were dead in our sins. And Jesus comes to us. And we're the man who's on the side of the road, left for dead, and he, to the greatest expense of himself, brings us back. And that's the gospel message. And then it allows us to follow what Paul says there, to bear one another's burdens, to do what the Good Samaritan does, to do what Jesus did for us. And so, fulfill the law of Christ. That's verse 2. For if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. So, all through Galatians, you cannot miss the gospel. When Paul's saying, on one hand, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ, but then in the next sentence he's saying, but if you think you're something, you're nothing, you deceive yourself. That's the gospel. We are nothing and everything at the same time. Martin Luther had a saying in Latin that is translated as simultaneously justified and a sinner. That's our identity, that we are both a sinner and justified. We are completely loved by Jesus, but at the same time, a sinner. So we need to preach the gospel to ourselves constantly so we can walk in that identity. Preach the gospel to ourselves constantly so we can walk in that identity. I'll just be transparent for a second. As someone who stands up here a lot to preach, there's others that preach, but I'll just tell you, when I preach, I think about, and this is where I'm transparent, I think about how I'm going to sound to people. I don't want to sound stupid. That may not be a bad thing, but sometimes it can be vainglory. I want to sound smart. I want people to respect what I have to say. So I want them to think I know what I'm talking about, that I actually went to seminary and I learned a lot of things, and I have a lot of things that God's taught me, and I have much to say. And that can go so far as to want to say things maybe a little differently. That would be just like stretching the truth a little bit. I can catch myself there. Oh, what am I doing? If I want to make myself sound really good right there, so that people will respect me. And so I have to stop there. I did it this week, and I preached the gospel to myself. And I said, you are loved by Jesus, and he sees you for who you are. And I know, Jesus, that you were completely disrespected so that I could be fully loved. I had to preach the gospel to myself in that moment to understand who I was. So preach the gospel to ourselves, but also preach the gospel to others. And today I'm talking mostly about like how we do that in community. We are to be people of the gospel who are people on mission to preach the gospel. We're gonna talk about that next week. But in community with one another, we have to go back to these everyday problems, like I mentioned earlier. We have a problem with our boss, we have a problem with a roommate, problem with a friend, and we have to preach the gospel to each other as we are in relationship with one another. So I read a really helpful, this is just good application right here. When we're in a situation and we're like, okay, where do we start? There's 4 questions that a pastor, Jeff Vanderstelt, offers in his book, Gospel Fluency. As we're working through these issues of life, here, put up that slide. I think I have it on there. He says, here's 4 questions you can ask. Sorry, I don't know how readable that is. 1, how does the gospel bring good news to the situation? When you're going through something and you're talking to a friend, like, how right now would the gospel bring good news? 2, what about the gospel do you need to hear right now? Is it that I'm desperately flawed, or is it that I'm more loved? 3, what about the gospel have we forgotten or failed to believe? And then 4, how is Jesus better than what we have or what we want? These are just practical questions we can ask when we're in a situation. So I was talking this week with someone who was experiencing a disappointment, and I also felt that for them. I also was disappointed in that situation, and in there I said something to the effect of, Jesus is better than what you're going through right now. And that was my attempt to preach the gospel to them. And it was a lot more there. I won't give you the whole conversation, but that's the idea. Like, let's go back to the gospel and believe that even in this situation, Jesus is bigger, he's stronger, he's greater, and he's shown himself to be because of the gospel message. So preach the gospel to ourselves and preach the gospel to others. I'm going to close with the main part of the sermon with this quote from Ray Ortlund. He says that gospel-centered churches are living proof that the good news is true, that Jesus is not a theory, but is real, and he gives back to us our humanness. In its doctrine, culture, word, and deeds, such a church makes visible the restored humanity only Christ can give. So that's the vision, the picture that I'd like to paint for 5 Points Church. To be a gospel-centered church, that we be living proof that the good news is true. That when people see a group of people who are completely messed up in every possible way, but yet live in complete boldness, knowing that they're loved in Jesus, knowing that they're forgiven, knowing that they have a relationship with this God of the universe, that they're different, that we really come across different because the gospel has so taken root in us. So I'll finish there with just this thought of, like, if you don't know Jesus, would you turn to him today? Would you put your trust in him and believe this gospel? What we believe we do. Our beliefs are shown by what we do. And if you believe in Jesus, that will become fruit in your life. If you believe in Jesus and trust in him, he says you will be saved. And so that's my call to you, to believe the gospel and to be saved. We would say next, your opportunity is to be baptized. If you've trusted in Jesus and you've never been baptized, Jesus set an example for us in baptism. He said that, follow in my example. Baptism is a symbol of us being buried with Christ. We go under the water and we come out of the water, and that demonstrates our new life we have in Jesus. I'm really excited. Sometime in the next few weeks, I really think we're going to have to baptize someone. Someone's going to be ready for this step. And so if that's you, just come and tell me or one of the other elders or somebody else you know who will get to us, and we'll make sure we can set that up for baptism. If you're ready to take that step of baptism, if you want to call on Jesus for salvation, baptism is that step for you to take. And so there's that. Two, is just thinking about how the gospel will affect us as we become a church. I want to just speak a word on membership. We started with a little group of people here as this church got started, and that group of people covenanted together and became a church. And we are actively working and being a church. And as that church, we'll start adding family members. We'll have a membership class, a 3-week class starting on September 29th that will talk about what it means to be a member here. And I think a better term is family. It's weird, like to say member, like you're not a member of a country club. That's not what this is. But you're a family member. You're a part of the family. You play a part. Just like in 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about the idea of a body. There's feet, there's hands, there's eyes, there's ears. Everybody has a part to play in the local body. And so maybe that will be a next step for you. And as members of the body, our job will be to speak the gospel to each other. That's what this message is about. To start casting the vision of what it will look like for us to speak the gospel to one another and live. And here's one really practical way, as we're about to officially launch 5 Points Church. And what we mean by that is we're going to kick into full gear this fall. And one practical way we're going to walk this out is in something called house fellowships. We'll start house fellowships right after Labor Day, and there'll be groups of people that will meet in a home, and in those places, we believe we'll walk out what an Acts 2 church is. That's our mission, to be an Acts 2 church. And so with these house fellowships, we'll get people together, and this will be the place. It's hard in here when we give a sermon and we sing songs, and we'll give testimonies and things like we've all done today. But sometimes it's hard to actually speak into someone's life. And to set that environment up, we'll have these house fellowships. You'll hear more about that. The next action step for you is 2 weeks from today. If you can stay after our service, we're going to have dinner provided, and we'll talk all about house fellowships. I'll try to give you all what they are, what it's going to look like, how you can get involved, what to do. And so it'll be really simple. We'll have our service. Afterwards, we'll eat dinner. And then we'll tell you all about house fellowships. So, just practical stuff. And then last, next Sunday, we're calling it Launch Sunday. As we think about, we started services in January. We started figuring out how do we do this? How do we even have a service? And we still do weird things sometimes because we don't know what we're doing. But here we are. We're believing God wants us to have a church here. And it's been really cool just how God's brought people together and made us this church. As we think about this fall, this has been our chance to really launch ourselves, to start membership, to start ministry to college students. College students, stay after the service, eat dinner. We're going to be inviting a lot of college students in as they come back on campus. We'll start other initiatives, serving our community, loving our community. We're about to give some big gifts out to the community for just to take some of the money that's been given to Five Points Church and then give that back out. And so just lots of that will be happening as we launch. And so next Sunday, we're going to call it our official launch Sunday. You're going to hear next Sunday all about like the vision of the church, where we think God has us going, and how all this is all founded and centered on the foundation of the gospel. And so there you go. This is bringing the practical, everyday, like announcement stuff into like the message. And I hope all this has made sense. If you have questions, I'd love to just talk through and help you understand, how all this works. Me or any of the other elders. So just the guys who are elders, you guys raise your hands so just people know and see. I have Craven right there, and Ricky, and John, and Robbie. Those are the elders that God's put up in this church to lead this church. And so if you have questions, ideas, thoughts, come to any of us.